Hi, and welcome to EU Untangled, the podcast that untangles EU policy and politics. I'm your host, Victor Aguilar.
And I'm your co-host, Alex Roth.
Today is December 8th. The end of the year is closing in.
And it is a good moment to look back at the past year and briefly untangle 2025.
Yeah, let's get started.
But wait, before we start, a brief disclaimer. All the opinions expressed by us are strictly ours and cannot be associated with any third party.
Let's go. January 1st, the year gets off to a great start for the EU. Bulgaria and Romania fully joined the borderless Schengen area, bringing the number of EU member states participating in Schengen to 25. The only holdouts are Cyprus and Ireland.
The good news then are slightly darkened by Donald Trump's return to the White House on January 20th.
Well, depends who you ask. On that same day, January 20th, the European Commission presents a competitiveness compass, a new economic strategy. It gives more emphasis on economic competitiveness and represents a shift away from the previous major strategy of the European Commission, the EU Green Deal.
Back to good news, on February 9th, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania fully disconnect from Russian and Belarusian networks and join the European continental electricity grid ahead of schedule. So that's really nice.
Okay, on a sour turn of events, February 14th, Day of Love, J.D. Vance gives a speech at the Munich Security Conference, which was seen by many as the US taking distance from Europe on security matters. Vance argued that the greatest threat to European democracy comes from internal threats, namely through mass migration and alleged attacks on free speech by European institutions, instead of focusing on Russia as a major external threat to the EU.
2025 saw several elections. We will not cover all of them. On February 23rd, though, Germany went to the polls and elected a new parliament and also then a new government. First came out the Christian Democrats, and they took over power from the Social Democrats. However, Social Democrats remained in power as a junior coalition partner.
On March 4th, the European Commission announced its Rearm Europe Plan/Readiness 2030 program, an ambitious defense package to leverage about 800 billion euros in defense spending across EU member states. Just another indicator of Europe's will, some would say pressure, to become more strategically independent on the world stage.
And I think a really big deal because so far the EU and the EU Commission has never really been involved into defense. So quite a big thing. Shortly after, on March 11, the European Commission proposed a so-called common European system for returns to speed up and simplify the return of non-EU nationals who have no legal right to stay in the EU after having received a return decision in one of the member states. That aims to make the entire system more effective.
Quarter 2. On April the 2nd, also known as Liberation Day, US President Trump announced 20% tariffs on the EU and many other countries around the world.
On May 4th and May 18th, Romania held its presidential elections. Nicu Jordan, an independent candidate, beats George Simion, founder of the far-right Alliance for the Union of Romanians. This is the end to the annulled 2024 presidential election engulfed in allegations of Russian interference to favor pro-Russian candidate Karolin Georgescu.
On May 18, there is also a presidential election in Poland. Karol Nawrocki from the conservative right-wing Law and Justice Party wins the elections, crushing Prime Minister Donald Tusk's hopes for a unified pro-EU government in Poland.
And so we now slip into the third quarter, which starts on July 10th with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who survives a so-called non-confidence vote in the European Parliament, which was tabled by the ECR group. The ECR is a far-right group. The motion would have needed 360 votes to pass, and only 175 out of 720 MEPs voted in favor. Had the motion passed, von der Leyen and her team of commissioners would have had to stand down, and a new commission would have had to be set up. This is the first attempt to oust a president of the European Commission since 2014. The hold of the centrist parties in the European Parliament is not as strong as it used to be.
July 16. The European Commission proposes the EU's next multi-annual budget for the period 2028-2034, also known as the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, or MFF. This is almost 2 trillion euros, or about 1.26% of the EU's gross national income. The new budget is larger and structured differently. More importantly, the EU Commission wants to have a larger say on how the money is spent. Expect a negotiation battle between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council in the coming months as they agree on the fine print and how exactly the money should be spent. Popcorn out!
Yay! Well, talking about money, we can continue on July 26th, where Ursula von der Leyen and US President Trump agreed to a provisional trade deal, which would mean import tariffs of 15% for most products that are imported from the EU to the US. While lower than the initial tariffs announced in April on the so-called Liberation Day, these tariffs are still substantially higher than in pre-Trump levels and hence criticized by many.
September 29th, US President Donald Trump announces a 20-point Gaza peace plan, crucially without significant involvement from the EU.
In the fourth quarter, we start with another election. On October 3rd and 4th, the Czech Republic holds its parliamentary election, and EU skeptic Babiš regains power, prompting some analysts to worry that the country's government might slide further to the right.
And not to be left behind, on October the 6th, Sébastien Lecornu resigns as Prime Minister of France only 27 days after taking office and barely a day after naming his government. He would go back to being Prime Minister 6 days later on the 12th of October. This marks 5 different Prime Ministers in France in the past 2 years.
On October 9th, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission's president, survives a second no-confidence vote in the European Parliament, tabled by far-right parties, but also supported by some far-left parties.
This relief will be brief because on October the 24th, European leaders failed to agree to use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine's defense. The European Commission had proposed using around 140 billion of Russian frozen assets held by Euroclear, based in Brussels, to finance repatriation loans for Ukraine. However, Belgium has opposed the move, arguing that this could translate into legal retaliation by Russia and has demanded additional assurances from EU member states before agreeing to this deal. We are recording on the 8th of December, and this story is still unfolding.
October 29th, there were national elections in the Netherlands. And after Geert Wilders had left the former coalition, that had led to a collapse of the former government. Well, it didn't go too well for him. The D66 party came out first, and Geert Wilders actually lost quite a few seats in parliament and will probably be not part of the next government.
On November 11th, the European Parliament backs the European Commission's so-called Sustainability Omnibus, a package of reforms that cut and simplifies some of the previous sustainability regulations of the EU. For the first time, in a major policy file, the European People's Party, the major centre-right party in the European Parliament, cooperated with far-right parties instead of other pro-EU centre parties to approve this legislation.
The first omnibus was followed by a second omnibus on November 19. The EU Commission proposes the so-called digital omnibus, which is a package to streamline rules on the digital sphere, namely in the field of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and data, to ease compliance for European business and to save up an estimated 5 billion euros in administrative costs by 2029. However, also watering down some of the privacy laws.
On November 20th, the Ukraine-Russia so-called peace plan is leaked. And judging by its content, some speculate that the biggest contributions came from Russia and not Ukraine or its European allies.
And on December 5th, the US releases its so-called security strategy, which is basically a reiteration of some of the elements the Vice President J.D. Vance had already named in its speech in February in Munich. Among many things, the strategy proposes that the EU policy should prioritize, quote-unquote, resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. And the strategy openly also supports far-right parties in the EU and their ideas, while strongly attacking European institutions for allegedly undermining political liberty and free speech.
December 8th, your favorite EU-based podcast records the last episode of the year. It has been a busy year. And if we had to sum it up in 3 points, I'd say that the first one is that we've seen a strong emphasis on EU defense and autonomy.
Absolutely. And this came together with a continuous shift to the right at national and European level. In many elections, more and more right-wing parties won. And also on the European level, the right-wing parties influenced more and more policymaking.
And the third and final point would be that we are seeing a push for simplification and deregulation at the European level in an attempt to have Europe stay competitive vis-a-vis the US and China.
Yeah, well, a few years ago, everybody was talking in Brussels about the environment and climate. This has largely disappeared, and now the topics of prices, cost, and competitiveness are all over the place in most of the panel discussion we have here in town.
Defense, autonomy.
You name it.
That was our last episode of 2025.
We hope you enjoyed it. Even the overall tone was maybe a bit gloomier than we wanted to, but unfortunately, we can also not really change what happened in this year.
Life is life. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other people discover the show.
And you can follow EU Untangled on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Blue Sky to stay updated on future episodes and behind-the-scenes content.
Remember that we really would love to hear from you, whether it's feedback on this episode, ideas for future topics, or just a hello, or a hola. Just send us an email at mail@untangle-podcast.eu.
You heard how Vic said really. He really means it.
I do.
Anyway, thanks for listening and see you next year.
Happy holidays. Bye.